Welcome, everyone. My name is Sal Robinson, and I'm the curator of Franz Kafka, the exhibition. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope you've had a chance to see it this evening, and if not, it's open until April 13th. Please come back. Now it's an honor and a pleasure to have Michelle Woods with us here tonight. Professor Woods is the author of Translating Milan Kundera, Censoring Translation, Censorship, Theater, and the Politics of Translation, and Kafka Translated, How Translators Have Shaped Our Reading of Kafka, about which she will speak tonight. Half Irish and half Czech, Woods graduated from Trinity College Dublin and was a Fulbright Fellow and an IRCHSS Government of Ireland Fellow. Her translations have appeared in Words Without Borders and in Granta. She is an associate professor of English at SUNY New Paltz, and she has recently completed a book about translations of Anna Karenina. Please join me in welcoming Professor Woods.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Sal Robinson for a wonderful Kafka exhibit and for inviting me here, and also Kat Kiernan and the team here at the Morgan Library. So today, I'm talking about these two remarkable women, Milena Jesenská, who's the first translator ever of any of Kafka's work, and Willa Muir, who with her husband was the first English language translator of Kafka's work. And as we'll see through the talk, I hope, they're remarkable women in their own right, as well as the work that they did with Kafka's texts. I want to start, and maybe it feels very relevant, with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. It brought to the end the Prague Spring, this amazing flowering in the 60s in Czechoslovakia of art and politics, really, this thaw in 20 years of, at that point, of communist rule. When the Soviets invaded, though, there was a rush to get texts published because they were worried, everyone was worried that if they didn't publish it right then, the Soviets would once again, and they did, instigate this intense repression and censorship of texts. And this was one book that was rushed to print by Jana Černá, herself a poet and writer, about her mother, Milena Jesenská. And this book was a memoir of a mother that she last saw when she was 11 years old. She felt, because after the war, after the communist coup in 1948 in Czechoslovakia, they banned all mention of Milena Jesenská. She was seen as a Trotskyite, as someone who was anti-communist. Along with Kafka, who she translated, she was banned. There were some rumors about her, there was propaganda about her, and so her daughter really wanted to rehabilitate her mother and to kind of stave off this propagandistic image of her, but also this image that had grown in the West of Jesenská as only being important because she was Kafka's lover, which is a complicated thing in itself. Černá was 11 years old when her mom was picked up by the Gestapo. The way she tells it, she went to pick up some underground newspapers from another apartment. Her mother was then editing and writing for a resistance newspaper called Boy, Into the Struggle. She had sent her 11-year-old to pick up these newspapers thinking that she'd look innocent and she'd be okay. She arrived at the apartment, the Gestapo were there and said, "You've got to take us back to your home." She brought them back to the house in this street called Kozhimska, which, if you look, is just around the corner from the new Jewish cemetery where Franz Kafka was buried in 1924. So less than 15 years later, his translator is being picked up by the Gestapo, who followed her 11-year-old daughter home, and they arrest Jesenská. Her daughter says that it was the last time her daughter saw their home. She saw her mother once again alive in the Gestapo headquarters in Prague and never saw her again. But she said, we were lucky in a way because she would have been shot immediately if they'd realized that our apartment was also the hiding place for a number of communists and Jewish friends who stayed in the apartment and were smuggled out by Jesenská and an acquaintance, basically, Count Joachim von Zedwitz, in the trunk of his very sporty car. They were taken across the border, including Jesenská's partner, Yevgen Klinger, who survived the war. She refused to go. She thought she wouldn't be killed. She ended up, though, dying in Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp. She was sent there in 1940 and died of kidney infection in 1944. Her daughter didn't believe that she was dead. Like many, hoped that her mother would come back from the camps. But in fact, a camp inmate arrived one day and sat down at her kitchen table and dropped a tooth on the table. And she said, this is what I have. It's your mother. It's your mother's. And Cherna said, on the table before my eyes lay a piece of her body, a segment of her smile, a part of the mouth that had once talked to me. Cherna went on to say that she lost it immediately. She put it somewhere safe and never found it again, which is, a pity. But in 1945, after the war, by the time this tooth landed on her table, Jesenská was in fact far more famous in Czechoslovakia than Kafka was. Directly after the war, a friend of theirs, Willi Haas, he asked one of Jesenská's friends, a school friend, Stasia Jilowska, who incidentally was a famous translator in her own right. She translated Woolf and Joyce, etc., into Czech. But she said to Willi Haas, she says, I don't know, does anyone care about Kafka? She says Czech circles are not interested in him. Indeed, almost no one knows him. And only the Castle is translated. One publisher said that they will publish all of the work, but I don't believe in its success. It was interesting that at that point, Jesenská was seen, she'd published several hundred articles in Czech in the 20s and 30s. She was known as a translator. She was far more famous than Kafka in her homeland. But by 1948, and after the communist coup in Czechoslovakia, both Kafka and Jesenská were banned. All mention of them were banned. Their books were banned. So there was this kind of organized forgetting of her impact on Czech society and his impact too. Meanwhile, while she was forgotten officially in communist Czechoslovakia, she was shooting to fame in the West, primarily because of two texts. The first, and you can see one of the letters in the exhibition here, the letters to Milena, published initially in German in 1952, translated into English in 1953. These wonderful letters, and if you haven't read them, you should. They're beautiful letters from Kafka to Jesenská. She gave her letters to Max Brod and he burnt them, so we don't have her replies. The second was this book by someone who's in the concentration camp with her, Margareta Buber-Neumann, called in German Milena Kafka's Freundin. It was first published in English actually as Mistress to Kafka, The Life and Death of Milena, right? It's still Milena, the tragic story of Kafka's great love. What's interesting about this, of course, the interest then, because Kafka had become hugely famous in the West, so famous even by 1947 that Edmund Wilson in The New Yorker said enough already with this Kafka mania, we've got to stop, because of Willa Muir, who I'm going to talk about, his works have touched this kind of global audience, this English and global audience. So everyone wants to know everything about them, and these letters to one of his lovers is of real interest. Buber-Neumann's book is interesting because she paints, it's a very loving book about this friend she made in a concentration camp, but she paints Kafka as Jesenská's only love. And I found when I was looking textually at the book that, in fact, she got all her stories from Kafka's diaries and the letters to Milena. So I'm a bit unsure as to how much Milena Jesenská was actually talking about Kafka or not. It's very interesting. So in the West, Milena Jesenská, known simply as Milena, Kafka's love, becomes this kind of, interesting figure, all only related to Kafka, who she only knew for 3 years of her life. In 1968, before the Soviet invasion, another book came out, which was the Czech translation of Letters to Milena, Dopisy Milenia, translated by Hanna Žantovská, but with this great introduction by František Kautman, who really wanted to rehabilitate her within a Czech context. And he really talks about her role as a writer, a journalist, and as a translator, and how that really affected Czech culture. This book was also banned after the Soviet invasion, so there was this moment in 1968 where she was being remembered within the Czech sphere as a literary figure, not just as Kafka's lover or Kafka's girlfriend, right? And these are some publications, a publication of her article, Cesta k jednoduchnosti, and her articles, which I'm going to talk about in Přítomnost. So Kautman, he says, Kafka held Milena's translations, which are of really good standard and high esteem. He was happy she was translating his work. He said that Kafka also recognized her worth as a writer, as a feuilletonist. In Czech, they really took this idea of the personal essay. It's very typical in Czech journalism of personal essay talking about these wider social or political things. And he said, and I think this is really important, Milena connected Kafka to the Czech nation, to its language and its culture. His letters to her were a part of our cultural heritage, right? This idea that Kafka's part of, Czech culture because of his connection to this writer, Jesenská, who was so revered. And here we have, it's a picture of the first ever translation of Kafka's work. In 1920, April 1920, Jesenská published her translation of his story Der Heiser, The Stoker, which some of you may know is the first chapter of the novel America, or The Man Who Disappeared. It's in a socialist magazine, Kamen, a popular literary socialist magazine. She translates it. And in fact, the editor of the magazine puts this at the end, on the last page of the story. He says, "This story, with which we fill the whole issue, belongs to the best of modern German stories. We decided it would be better if we did not serialize it, but present it whole to our readers as an unusual but pleasant exception." This is very unusual because they put parts of stories and the next day they'd have the rest of it. But we can see, our image of Kafka is that he wasn't known in his lifetime. Some people think he wasn't even published in his lifetime, which he was in German. Some of his stories were published and they were recognized by writers like Robert Musil as being important. But I think this is really important, seeing the Czechs read the story and identify it as being an important part of the literary culture. In fact, we have a letter from Kafka to his sister, his beloved sister Ottla, saying, "Please go run out and buy 20 copies of it. There's a translation by Frau Milena. I want to see it," right? So we can see his reaction to it. And of course, this is what begins their correspondence, right? And Kafka, he says to her, "Your German's amazing." And on those occasions when it does falter, the German language becomes pliant just for you. And he says, a German wouldn't dare write so personally. "I'm moved by your faithfulness towards every little sentence," he says. And he said, "I don't know if the Czechs they'll hold its very faithfulness against you." And then he says, and I love this because we see the kind of sexual nature coming in, or certainly where he says, "Go ahead and scold me on account of this faithful. I know you can do everything, but maybe you scold best of all. I'd like to be your pupil, just so you'd constantly scold me. I'm sitting at my desk, scarcely daring to look up. You're bent over me and your index finger is glittering in the air, finding fault. Isn't that the way?" He says, he said, when he's talking about the language itself, he says, I have the feeling that I'm taking you by the hand through the story's subterranean passages, gloomy, low, ugly, almost endless. That's why the sentences are almost endless. Didn't you realize that? Almost endless, which is hilarious if anyone's read a Kafka sentence. He's playing with the idea that he can't stop a sentence. They just go on forever. And he says, hopefully, in order to have the good sense to disappear into the daylight at the exit, hence the title of the talk. And then he says later, please send me the translation. I can't hold enough of you in my hands, right? So he's really appreciating the translations. But he's also asking her to send her feuilleton, these short articles that she's writing in Vienna. Just an example, I won't read the whole thing, don't worry. But an example of this is from the story, The Stoker. And one of the jokes in The Stoker is that this boy who ends up, it begins with him arriving in New York Harbor. And he's been sent away by his parents because he's impregnated their maid. So instead of sending the maid away with the baby, they send the boy away, never to be seen again. But also there's this, I mean, it's a bit dodgy, this whole sequence, but we get the maid chasing him around the apartment or hiding from him. And she keeps jumping out, and then eventually she gets him into bed, and he doesn't know what to do. He says all he remembers is lying on her stomach, right? But the style of it is very interesting because you see this repetition in the English. This is Michael Hoffman's translation. Sometimes, 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 sometimes. Once, Carl! It's this orgasmic paragraph. It builds up with this repetition of sometimes, sometimes, sometimes. And we see that Jesenská understands this in the Czech. This is why she's so faithful. She's completely faithful to this quite odd and experimental syntax. We see her at the niekdy, 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 jedno, Karla, so this idea that she understands what's going on in the syntax. And the comedy and the euphony of the work. She translated quite a lot of the stories in various Czech papers between 1920 and 1923. So she's quite busy. She's also translating from French and Russian and German, other German writers as well. Why is she translating so much? She's broke, is the answer. Jesenská was born to a very well-off Czech family. Her dad was a professor of medicine, and she was part of this generation. She was famous for her beauty. She was actually well known as a beauty on the streets of Prague, which makes her sound slightly dodgy. I don't mean that. But she was also famous. She's part of a generation, the first generation of Czech language women to be educated in what's called a gymnasium, academic high school, to go to university. There was this idea that when the Czech nation came to be, women were not only going to be producing babies for this new nation, but would be the doctors, the teachers, the engineers of this new nation, right? There was a real sense of equality. And she, in fact, got into medical school. But before she did, she started hanging out at the Café Arco, which is where the Czech Jewish writers would meet, including, we have this nice picture of Kafka as a young man with Max Brod on the beach, and Oskar Polak, another writer with whom Jesenská fell in love. And this was a huge scandal. She was she didn't come from a Jewish family, she came from a Czech-speaking family. And so to cross the divide in the different groups in Prague was a huge issue. She became pregnant, and with Polak's baby. And in fact, her dad decided to put her in a psychiatric hospital to commit her, and then performed the abortion on her. She ended up escaping over the wall from the psychiatric hospital. And her father finally agreed to the marriage, but he said, you have to go to Vienna. I want you out of Prague and away from the scandal. She goes with Polak to Vienna. In 1918, it was this pivotal moment for both Prague and Vienna. Vienna was the defeated capital of an empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was huge amounts of unemployment, of inflation. On the other hand, Czechoslovakia had just become a democracy, and quite a liberal democracy, and was, had this future ahead of it. It was full of excitement. There was money there. So it was kind of an unfortunate choice to end up in Vienna, especially with Polak, who turned out to be a complete philanderer and would bring his mistresses back to their studio apartment and so on. As a result, she was broke. She decided, through her friend Stasia Jeloska, she decided to translate and to start writing articles, including these deeply personal articles. And this is an example of one that I love, which is about her suicide attempt. So this is 1921 in a national newspaper. And she writes about it, you know, because she's at her wit's end. Her husband's this philanderer, she's no money. And she talks about her concierge, Mrs. Kohler, who decides to make her Czech dumplings because she was so sick at one point after this attempt that she kept apparently talking about Czech dumplings. And she says, yeah, so she made me these Czech, she wakes up to this large black dumpling being stuffed in her mouth. And she said, well, Mrs. Kohler has a sentimental notion of what Czech dumplings are. I think I will never poison myself again. Not because I'm afraid of death, no, but because I'm more afraid of Mrs. Kohler's dumplings, right? She was very subversive in these articles she was writing. She's only 25 when she's writing this, because she writes about fashion, she writes about cooking, she writes about kind of female things, but she also writes about divorce, drug addiction, suicide, these, you know, much deeper kind of things that she sticks into them. And she becomes well known. She's still in Vienna, but people are running out and reading these articles, you know, interested with them. When Kafka dies, she also publishes an obituary in one of the main Czech papers. And it's really moving because she says, amongst other things, few people knew him here. But he has written the most significant books of German literature. All his books paint the horror of secret misunderstandings, of innocent guilt between people. Right, so she's making a case for him, you know, even though she thinks that many Czechs won't know him, but that she's convinced that he's going to be or is a really important writer. That's what, you know, when we think of Jesenská and Kafka, we're like, that was her life. She was Kafka's lover. He wrote these letters to her, whatever, right? That's the end of it. But of course, her life went on. She ends up moving back to Prague in 1925. Well known already as a journalist, she marries a famous architect, Jaromír Krejcar, a famous constructivist, modernist architect. And they're really at the center of these vibrant Czech artistic and intellectual circles. Their apartment, which he builds, it's still there in Prague, in the center of Prague, becomes a famous meeting place for, you know, filmmakers, photographers, writers, architects. And she's writing all these articles. This is an example of one of her articles that's about fashion, but really about how women are kind of constrained by fashion and so on. They have a child, Jana Černá, who we've seen before, who was known by them as Honza, Johnny, basically, Honzička. So they have this kind of idyllic life. She's becoming famous as a journalist. But what happens, he goes to Russia, Jaromír Krejcar, and they're both communists. They're both members of the Communist Party at this part in 1933. He goes to Russia and sees what Stalinist Russia is like. He's horrified. He comes back and not only disabuses her of communism, but he comes back with a Russian lover, and their marriage ends. So she ends up moving out and ends up meeting Evgen Klinger, a communist newspaper man. But she's famous in her own right, and she ends up in Kozimska, where she's picked up by the Nazis. But not only is she writing women's kind of, you know, articles about women's lives, but especially after 1933, she becomes a political journalist. She's an outspoken anti-fascist, and she starts working for Přítomnost, one of the premier Czech monthly magazines. And very bravely, when the famous, he survived the war, Peroutka, when he's arrested by the Gestapo in March 1939, he's one of the first people they arrest when they come into Prague. She decides to take over the editorship. And it was a suicide mission, right, to take it over. And she keeps writing these articles about the fascists and about the Nazis. And I think there's a lovely quote from Stanislav Budin, who says her self-possessed voice in these articles, her self-possessed and at the same time passionate articles, became the one foothold, by a means by which her Czech readership could hang on to our sense of dignity and pride. And this is an example. She writes a lot about kind of verbal about the abuse of Jews. But she's this lovely article, I think, here, which is about when the Nazis invade Prague. The Czechs, who are they're not a fighting type, right? They end up meeting on the Old Town Square and putting snowdrops, it's March, right, onto the tomb of the unknown soldier. And she said the crowds they're just coming to put the snowdrops on there. And she said, it's all distinctly Czech. It's not a lament. It's not even fear. It is not despair. It is not a convulsion of emotion at all. It is only sadness. And she then says a Nazi soldier comes by and is kind of looking at everyone, wondering what's going on. But he sees the red eyes and the mountain of snowdrops. And she says he saluted, right? So she's writing about that. She wrote about the Sudetenland. She went there and interviewed people at the time. So she becomes really a vocal kind of anti-fascist when it's really dangerous, when the Nazis are in. And they stopped the publication of this paper in September 1939, by which time she's working for these underground papers. What's great, I noticed that, whereas we keep thinking in the West of, Kafka's Milena, and she's only connected with him, it's really interesting to see in Czechoslovakia now how she's been rehabilitated as a writer, a journalist, and so on, a translator in her own right. There have been excellent academic works on her. But I noticed this recently, there's a park named on Kožimska, her last address, for her. And here it says, it's called Milena Jesenská Park. But it says here, a park on Kožimska Street bears the name of an acclaimed journalist. On the 125th anniversary of her birth, a public reading of the work of this journalist, translator, and anti-Nazi resistance fighter was done. Right? There's no mention of Kafka at all in the whole article about it. This sense that we have to respect her for who she is. Right here. In 1945, the same year that Jana Černá had a tooth placed on her table, another couple arrive in Prague who are connected to Kafka, Willa and Edwin Muir. This is Willa on the left, Edwin on the right, and Natasha Spender, the artist, in the middle. They stayed in Prague. They were invited there to work for the British Council directly after the end of the war. The Nazis had closed all universities in Czechoslovakia during the war, and the British Council was a way of getting, helping young students who are finally getting to university to speak English, and a part of a pro-democracy movement too. They were incredibly popular, the Muirs, and they were also famous in Prague because they had translated. The two of them had translated Kafka's work into English. They were the first translators of his work. In the 1930s, they translated his three unfinished novels. And also some of the stories a bit later on. So they'd made their name really as Kafka's translators, because now by the 40s he was globally famous. And through English, because he'd been banned in Germany under the Nazis. His work has been banned in 1933. So his fame really erupted through the war in English initially, and the sense that he was a voice for the time where people were dealing with fascism, the Holocaust, Stalinism, and so on. They translated this work, and not only Kafka, but in the 30s they also translated a number of important German Jewish writers, including Leon Feuchtwanger, Sholem Asch, and Hermann Broch, who became a personal friend. And in fact, they housed him when he escaped Europe in Scotland. They were living in Scotland at the time, before he ended up in the States. So they're really important, not only as Kafka translators, but also as translators of this kind of body of German literature as well. And The Sleepwalkers is a great novel if you want to read something great. The translations, though, of Kafka and these other writers, everyone thinks, until recently, everyone thought it was Edwin Muir, because Edwin Muir had made a name for himself as a poet, as a literary critic. He was really kind of revered, not as the most avant-garde poet. He was seen as a bit of a throwback, but certainly a poet of pre-modern ilk. But a very respected critic and reviewer. And so people judging the translations, and because he wrote the forwards to a lot of the translations, they thought, well, it must have been him, because he's such a wonderful he's such a wonderful writer, you know. And everyone was a bit murky about Willa Muir's involvement. They were like, well, maybe she did the literal translation, which there's no such thing as a literal translation. Then they'd also somehow say that it's the exuberant weird bits of the translation that were all her fault, right? Because she was a more outgoing character, like based on nothing, right? Really, you know. But there was a real sense that Edwin Muir, when people talked about the Muir's translations, they were interested really in Edwin Muir as a literary figure. And he's a really interesting person. This is Muir when he was younger. He was born in Orkney, a tiny island. And I love this map because it shows how closer Orkney is to Oslo than it is to London, right? It's this tiny island north of Scotland, right? And he came from an impoverished family. His family were farmers. They lost the farm when he was 14, and they moved to the mainland. And he was working as a clerk, writing some poetry, but mainly working as a clerk when he met Willa Muir. And then, you know, his kind of, I think largely thanks to her, but anyway, his career kind of took off. She was born, if Orkney is one of those northern islands, you might see an island north of there, which is even closer. It's closer to Bergen and to Oslo, which is Shetland, which some of you might know from the BBC TV series. Willa Muir was born in Shetland, so they're both born in Scots-speaking island families. And a similar trajectory with her family. They move to the mainland, her dad dies, and they live in incredible poverty. The difference with Willa Muir is that she's an outstanding student, and she ends up getting to St Andrews only a few years after it allowed women to study and take degrees at the university. And not only did she study at St Andrews, and this is her in the debating club at the back, but she also excelled there. She got a first in classical languages. She went back, studied English and history, got a first there. She was invited back, which was almost unheard of for a woman to teach as a teaching assistant in 1914-15, partly because of World War I. They were running out of men, but still there was a huge respect for her as an intellectual force on campus, especially when it came to languages. The other thing about her, though, Kirsty Allen in her PhD writes about, she just goes through all the student papers at the time, the newspapers and poetry papers. And she said, you just can't move without seeing Willa Muir's name. She was vice president of the debating club. She was vice president of the suffragettist club. She was a Fabian, a committed socialist. She was writing poetry. She was writing articles about women's rights. So she's an incredibly active and political figure. She met, actually, I want to talk about this before I talk about their meeting, but what's interesting about the way that she sees language is that both of them felt their whole lives slightly adjacent to English and slightly adjacent to English and maybe even British and maybe even Scottish culture. She writes a lot in her diaries in the archives about not quite, and in her memoir, about not quite ever fitting in because of their outsider nature, because of speaking Scots as a child, because of their class too, right? They're never seen as part of the bourgeoisie. And also, interestingly, she says, this note that I found on a torn piece of paper, and she says, what's a translator? And she defines it as this: intellectual bilocation, mentioned with surprise as a feat, being yourself and another, women do naturally. Which I love, right? So the sense of being an outsider in a patriarchal society, being an outsider as poor, being an outsider as a Scots speaker coming into English. And he feels that too. He says, this is Edwin Muir from his memoir, I'm not Scotch, I'm an Orkney man, a good Scandinavian, right? So this sense that he's not, because he refused to write in Scots. There was a revival of Scots-speaking poetry, but he said, I'm not part of that club either, right? So there's a sense that they live their lives always in between languages and cultures. Willa Muir, after lecturing in St Andrews, goes and works in some of the earliest women's colleges in London as a professor. And this is pretty remarkable at this time, right? It's the First World War. She works in a number of colleges, Bedford College, Gypsy Hill teacher training, and Mansfield House Settlement, which was, for the working class, to teach working class people. And she and Edwin were always committed to education for working class members of the working class. She goes back to Scotland for the weekend and meets Edwin Muir. and persuades him to come to London, which is how he meets all these literary figures, including T.S. Eliot, who becomes a good friend. But she also then decides, let's go abroad, let's get out of London, and let's just travel Europe. They were working with in one of literary magazine with Paul Selver, who translated the Chapeks, and so he said go to Prague. So in 1921, they actually go to Prague for the first time and live there for a few months. They then go to Germany and live there for a few years, in Austria as well, before heading back to London in the early 30s. But I like her comment about how he dealt with languages. She says, Edwin took one look at the Czech language and decided he didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. However, and look at the difference between the I and the us. I have our other interest in languages because, well, classics was my particular line. I had a classics degree and been doing Latin and Greek for years, and I like languages anyhow, and I couldn't live in a place without learning the language, so I wanted to learn Czech, and I did. And she does that in German too, but they start being asked to do these translations in German. And anytime Edwin Muir talks about translation, he hates it. He's like, we became a translation factory. He said it took up too much of our lives. It began as a resource and hardened into necessity. But what's interesting in her memoir, she keeps saying, we did this, but then talks about her doing the work. And she says, translation was my contribution in a letter in the 1960s, was my contribution as a partner so that Edwin should have more time for literary work and for brooding on poems. Yeah. But Willa herself was a writer. She published what is seen as quite an important Scots modernist novel in 1931, Imagine Corners, quite a beautiful novel. Before that, she'd published The Woolfs. Leonard and Virginia Woolf had published her essay, Women, an Inquiry, thinking about women's rights, as early as 1925. She published another one, Mrs. Ritchie, which was a real takedown of Calvinism and its effect, its patriarchal effect on women in Scottish life, Mrs. Ritchie, in 1933. But since she became the translation maven, right, while her husband was brooding on poetry, she kept writing novels, but they weren't published after this, until recently, in fact. She wrote a couple more novels, Mrs. Motto and the Top Story, which I'll talk about in The Usurpers. And she only finally, after his death, published a book about Scottish ballads, which was initially, he'd been paid to write it, but he died. And then her memoir, which is quite wonderful, Belonging, in 1968. So there's an element of her work being disrupted and frustrated by the fact that she had to translate so that they'd have money for Edwin Muir to write his poetry. Although it's a bit more complicated than that. They also had a child at this point, and so she was looking after the kid as well. And because of a difficult birth, was never fully healthy after the birth, and so there are all sorts of issues which will come up. They did most of their translation work in Hampstead in London. 7 Downshire Hill, which I just discovered that Constance Garnett, who translated Tolstoy's work and Dostoevsky's work, lived in 6 Downshire Hill a few years before. So it's really Translators' Row. Some great pieces of literature were translated here. But she also was writing this unpublished novel. I tried to get it published and no one was interested, but I might keep trying. Mrs. Motto and the Top Story. And it's about their life. It's a very lightly fictionalized portrait of what it was like to live with a kid. They had a kind of nanny maid, and with Edwin up in the top story doing his poems while she did all the translations. In the novel, it's just her, right? It's basically her doing, and she has 2 characters, Rheingold, which is Feuchtwanger. She hated his work, and she's like, I hate this Rheingold. We have to translate him, and we have to do it for the money. And then Granta, which is Max Brod, he wrote a novel in which he called Kafka Granta. So Granta is Kafka. When she's translating Granta, she's loving it. It's bringing her to this whole dream place that she's enjoying. But it's really interesting because in this novel, there's no messing about. She's like, I'm doing all the translation work, right? While he's writing his stuff. She says, as you can see here, we have to get it done. I know, darling, all the same, it will sell a good deal more than my book of essays, commented Dick, i.e. Edwin. Dick's literary gifts delighted only a small circle of appreciative readers. She's quite cutting in the novel. But there is this lovely image of him floating in the top story of this house, not being involved in the rest of the house, right? I really recommend her memoir, which you can get used fairly easily. That came out in 1968, several years after Edwin died. It's a great picture of England, Scotland, and continental Europe in the interwar years and during the wars. She came of age during World War I, really affected by World War II, and of translation of the literary world as well. But she was also making a statement with this book because she was a feminist her whole life. And she really wanted her marriage to be an exemplary marriage that was one that was exactly equal. Because that's not what she grew up with. That's not what she saw with people even in the literary world, right? But she wanted their marriage to be an example as this fully equal marriage. And as a result, she says of the translations, she says, people have asked me what was our technique in our joint Kafka translation. Simple enough. We divided the book in two. Edwin translated one half and I the other, and then we went over each other's translation with a fine-tooth comb. By the time we'd finished the going over about the two halves together, the translation was like a seamless garment, for we both loved the sinuous flexibility of Kafka's style, very unlike classical German, and dealt with it the same way. And she talks about ripping the books in half, and part of me was like, really? Would you really do that exactly in half? Who got more pages? It's a bit, And you see that she has this idea of having everything in a marriage is central to the book. She thinks the way of getting out of warlike Europe, all she's grown up with is war and death. And her, call out in the book is for what she calls loving kindness. And she believes it begins with marriage, with an equality in marriage that will allow a world that's not patriarchal, that's not warlike. And she says, I did think we were in the front line of advance for such marriages, and therefore very much in the front line of advance for making a new unwarlike society. So her insistence on the absolute equality fits into her whole narrative that she's writing after he's dead, of this perfectly equal marriage, right, and this perfectly equal translation task. When I went into the archives, her archives, I wanted to see if there wasn't much in terms of manuscripts, but I wanted to see what she said in private, because she was definitely making a case in belonging for this equality and this equal work in the marriage. And this is what I found. In 1953, a few years before Edwin died, he's still alive, she has this diary entry. And she says, even the translations I had done were no longer my own territory, for everyone assumes that Edwin did them. He's referred to as the translator. By this time, he may even believe he was. He has let my reputation sink by default, as now I fear that if the Feuchtwanger publishers are told I'm prepared to do his beastly novel, they will refuse unless Edwin engages to do it or to put his name to it, right? That she'll do the work and it'll be his name on it. And the fact remains, I am a better translator than he is. The whole current of patriarchal society is set against this fact, however, and sweeps it into oblivion. Simply because I did not insist on shouting aloud, most of this translation, especially Kafka, has been done by me. Edwin only helped. And every time Edwin was referred to as the translator, I was too proud to say anything. And Edwin himself felt it would be undignified to speak up, I suppose. So that now, especially since my breakdown in the middle of the war, partly due to the complications from the birth of her child earlier on, I'm left without a shred of literary reputation. And I'm ashamed of the fact that I feel it as a grievance. It shouldn't bother me. Reputation is a passing value after all. Yet it is now that I feel it. Now when I'm trying to build up my life again and overcome my disabilities, my dicky backbone, for instance, because I seem to have nothing to build on except that I am Edwin's wife and he still loves me. That is much. It is almost all, in a sense, that I could need. It is more than I deserve. And I know, too, how destructive ambition is and how it deforms what one might create. And yet, I want to be acknowledged. That is why I say, I am a mess. And I have to say, I cried when I read this in the archive. You know, just the fierceness of that feeling, right? This sense that she was like, look, I did the work. And it's, you know, she loves Edwin. She never didn't love him, you know. But this sense that the world just wasn't ready to acknowledge that the work that she had put in. And in fact, I mean, she's claiming here that she was the main translator of Kafka's work. There was a letter from 1960 from New Directions publishers saying to her, you translated America in 1938, and we talked with you and Edwin about doing these fragments. If you read America Now, you'll find these fragments at the end of the novel. And he says in the letter, Edwin's dead at this point, he says, we all know that you did the translation anyway, so would you mind doing these fragments? And so this insider knowledge that she was the translator, but they didn't want to say it, and the translation is under both their names. I think, and I'm almost finished, but I think what's really interesting about what Kafka offered her with this sinuous syntax, this long syntax, is that it offered a way out. In Mrs. Mutto in the top story, it brings her into this dream world. It frees her from this patriarchal world, this world where she's stuck kind of looking after a kid in a way, or doing all the household chores and having to work for money. And they're long quotes, but I'm almost finished. She got laughed at by a lot of Kafka scholars for the second quote. She and Edwin were invited to Harvard in 1955, and she took part in a colloquium on Kafka and on translation. And she wrote an essay about it. And I always laugh at this quote. It's like genuinely funny. But again, Kafka scholars kind of take her as not being serious because of what she's saying about German. So the quote here is, could one then deduce Hitler's Reich from the less ruthless shape of the German sentence? I think one could, and I think that is why I've come to dislike the German language. I find myself disliking the purposive control, the willpower dominating the German sentence. I dislike its subordination of everything to these hammer-blow verbs. I dislike its weight and its clotted abstractness. I have the feeling that the shape of the German language affects the thought of those who use it and disposes them to overvalue authoritative statement, willpower, and purposive drive. The right image for the German sentence, I suggest, is that of a great gut, a bowel, which deposits at the end of it a sediment of verbs. We should not forget that the favorite German word of abuse is scheiß, shit. And of course, Kafka scholars are like, what is this lady talking about? But I think this connection of a certain type of writing that she hated, that is connected to war, it's connected to the patriarchy, and that Kafka for her was a writer that was kind of beyond that, was doing something different with language, more sinuous, more sensuous with language. And I think it's also connected to this lovely quote I found in the archive about listening to BBC radio, and these two BBC laddies, she says, and they're chatting away in received pronunciation British to a Scots audience, right? And I love it. I can't do a Scots accent, but she says, look, it's just a mechanical emphasis of every second or third syllable that hurts my ear and makes a hash of the meaning. I grant you, if you want to frighten anybody or master anyone, the short, emphatic syllable is all you need. You can just say fee, fi, fo, fum. She says, but that kind of barking is surely far removed from the flow of friendly talk, for if they're unaware of the violence, of the mechanical violence in their treatment of words, it means that they're used to a world of mechanical violence. They've got the habit of it, poor laddies. That's why they didn't notice it. 2 wars. Aye, 2 wars. And these BBC laddies have grown up among wars. Maybe they didn't notice the machine gun rattle or the voices because they've been used to the rattle of machine guns. So this idea of these major languages, English and German, being used as propagandistic language, as warlike language, as patriarchal language, is really something that she's fighting against. And it's really important because, the Muirs were kind of attacked for using a very normative English, a very dull kind of English in some ways, but forgetting that they were post-colonial subjects, that they knew that the only way their translations would be published was if they were writing this accepted English. But in her archive, she falls into Scots quite a lot. We see her playing with the English language. We see her humour. This is something else they're accused of not having any humour, but they're hilarious. She's hilarious in her archive. But this sense that they have to button themselves up when it comes to publishing their translations. And it's only, it was maybe my kind of book, that came out 10 years ago, where I really argued for making a case for her importance as a Kafka translator, as someone who was coming from an unusual place in terms of thinking about Kafka, and also someone who kind of understood what he was doing with the language in his novels more so than she was given credit for. But she has recently, only in the last 2 years, one of her novels set in Prague in the 40s, The Usurpers, has been published by St. Andrews Press, and also a recent book about the literary marriage between Willa and Edwin Muir, which is quite good, came out 2 years ago as well. So there's kind of a sense that, yeah, she is important. She's an important literary figure in her own right, but also as this translator of Kafka, and as a more important figure as a translator than she's been given credence for. So just finally, there are two remarkable women, I think women ahead of their time, right? Both ardent feminists, both socialists, both committed anti-fascists, which I think is important in this day and age, really. They're important as translators because they're not only important for translating Kafka and thus making him famous, disseminating his work worldwide in the case of the English translations, in the case of Jesenská's translations, bringing him to his homeland audience, right, as well. But they show very early on that they understand why Kafka is great. Right, they're not jumping on the bandwagon in the 40s as part of Kafka mania, but they understand that what Kafka does with language, this playfulness in his sentences, these long sentences and so on, the repetition, is part of what's innovative and new and experimental. They both saw that. And it really tells us something about translators. It's not just being people who move from one language to another, but are hermeneutic, doing a hermeneutic task. They're really thinking about what this prose is doing, how it works, what Kafka's trying to do with the way that language moves in his work. But I also think it's important not only to kind of resurrect their work as translators of Kafka's work, but to see them as important literary figures in their own right, in their own cultures and here as well. And I think in the end, it's really important to see both Milena Jesenská and Willa Muir beyond Kafka.